Montana Territory, 1878. The unforgiving summer sun beat down on the parched earth as Jackson Vance squinted through the heat waves rising off the dusty trail. At 25, he'd already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The war had taken his father, the drought had taken their Texas ranch, and the fever had taken his mother and sister 3 winters back. Now he rode alone, a wanderer with nothing but his stallion Thunder, his Winchester rifle, and the bitter conviction that attachment only led to heartbreak. "This land takes everything you love, Thunder," Jackson murmured to his dun-colored companion, adjusting his worn Stetson to shield his eyes from the relentless sun. "Best a man keeps moving and keeps to himself." His lean frame sat easy in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath his dust-covered blue shirt, hands calloused from years of rope and reins. Despite the trail grime, his face retained a youthful handsomeness, strong jawline softened by a light stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a mouth that had all but forgotten how to smile. The local saloon girls in the last 3 towns had made their interest clear, but Jackson had no use for temporary comforts. He needed work, not distractions. Bridger Valley sprawled ahead, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence against the backdrop of distant mountains. He'd heard the Rocking M Ranch was hiring experienced hands, and Jackson needed the money if he was going to keep heading north to Montana's grasslands. Maybe there he'd find enough space to outrun the memories that haunted him. As Thunder carried him down the town's main street, Jackson's gaze swept the weathered storefronts with practiced wariness. The general store, the smithy, the saloon, predictable fixtures of these frontier outposts. What caught his attention, however, was the young woman struggling with a broken wagon wheel outside the mercantile. She couldn't have been more than 22, dressed in a simple blue calico dress that had seen better days. Her honey blonde hair was coming loose from its practical bun, framing a face flushed with exertion. What struck Jackson most wasn't her obvious beauty, though that was undeniable, but the determined set of her jaw as she attempted to prop the wagon bed with a wooden block, refusing assistance from an older gentleman who hovered nearby. "Miss, please let me fetch one of the men from the livery," the older man was saying. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels, but I can manage," she replied, her voice carrying a musical lilt that stopped Jackson in his tracks. "My father taught me how to change a wheel before I could read." Jackson found himself dismounting before he'd made the conscious decision. "Pardon me, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "That wheel looks mighty unwieldy for one person. Might I lend a hand?" She straightened, pushing back a strand of wayward hair, and Jackson found himself looking into the clearest green eyes he'd ever seen, like spring grass after rainfall. For a brief moment, something forgotten stirred in his chest. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm quite capable," she replied, measuring him with a glance that was neither coquettish nor unfriendly, simply assessing. "No doubt you are," Jackson said with a nod. "But my mother raised me not to ride past a challenge that 4 hands could solve quicker than 2. Jackson Vance, at your service." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed her face. "Sophia Winters," she replied. "And very well, Mr. Vance, I accept your assistance, though I feel I should warn you this wheel has been most stubborn today." Over the next half hour, Jackson discovered that Sophia Winters was indeed as capable as she'd claimed. She knew exactly how to position the blocks, when to brace the wagon, and how to test the repaired wheel. Her hands, though smaller than his, were equally calloused, speaking of a life of honest work. "You're not just passing through, then?" he asked as they secured the wheel. "No, my father and I have a small homestead about 3 miles east," she explained, wiping her hands on her apron. "We grow vegetables mostly, some grain, nothing fancy, but it's ours." There was pride in her voice, but something else too, a strain that suggested all was not well at the Winters homestead. Jackson had heard similar tones too many times not to recognize it. "Just you and your father?" "Yes, my mother died during our journey west 6 years ago." Sophia's expression remained composed, but her eyes reflected a familiar shadow of loss. "And you, Mr. Vance, what brings you to our humble Bridger Valley?" "Work," he answered simply. "Heard the Rocking M might be hiring." "Marcus Montgomery's spread," Sophia nodded. "Good cattle, good land." "They lost several hands to the silver strike up north." She hesitated, then added, "If you're looking for room and board before you speak with Mr. Montgomery, my father and I have a spare room. We occasionally take in boarders. $3 a week includes meals." Jackson's instinct was to decline. Getting involved with locals, even as a boarder, meant connections, expectations. Yet something about Sophia Winters' straightforward manner gave him pause. This wasn't a damsel seeking rescue, but a practical woman making a business proposition. That's a fair price, he said finally, if you're sure it wouldn't be an imposition. Not at all. We could use the income and frankly, she hesitated, glancing toward the gathering clouds on the horizon. Having another man around the property wouldn't be unwelcome. There's been trouble with cattle rustlers in the area. There it was, the real reason behind her offer. Jackson knew he should still decline, keep to his plan of a quick stop before moving on. Entanglement meant vulnerability. Yet as thunder nickered softly beside him, Jackson found himself nodding. I accept your offer, Miss Winters, lead the way. The Winters homestead revealed itself after a dusty 3-mile journey. A modest but sturdy cabin flanked by a weathered barn, a chicken coop, and carefully tended fields stretching toward a creek lined with cottonwoods. It wasn't grand by any measure, but Jackson recognized the marks of careful stewardship in the straight fence lines and the healthy crops pushing up from the soil. Harold Winters proved to be a thin man in his early 60s with a noticeable limp and a firm handshake. His initial suspicion of the young cowboy quickly gave way to cautious welcome when Sophia explained how Jackson had helped with the wagon wheel. Any man willing to help my daughter without being asked is welcome at our table, the older man said, showing Jackson to a small but clean room at the back of the cabin. Though I should warn you, Sophia drives a hard bargain on the chores in exchange for her cooking. Father, Sophia protested with a laugh that transformed her face entirely. The sound struck Jackson like an unexpected melody. I'm not afraid of honest work, sir, Jackson replied, setting his saddlebags on the narrow bed. Been earning my keep since I was 12. Over a simple but satisfying supper of rabbit stew and corn bread, Jackson learned more about the Winters situation. They had claimed their homestead 5 years ago after arriving from Pennsylvania. Harold had been a schoolteacher back east before the call of land ownership drew them west. They were making a modest living selling vegetables to the town and neighboring ranches, but Harold's leg, broken badly in a fall 2 winters prior, limited what he could manage alone. We've had offers to buy us out, Harold explained, his weathered face solemn in the lamplight, particularly from the Bar S ranch north of here. Their owner, Spencer, has been consolidating smaller properties for the past year. Father believes in holding our ground, Sophia added, her chin lifting slightly. This land is ours by right of sweat and perseverance. And your mother's sacrifice, Harold added softly, his hand briefly covering his daughter's. She believed in what we were building here. Jackson nodded, understanding all too well the weight of carrying on for those who couldn't. The rustlers you mentioned, they targeting small spreads like yours. A shadow crossed Sophia's face. 3 of our milk cows disappeared last month. The Petersons lost 5 head, and the Wilsons had their entire flock of sheep driven off. Sheriff Miller says he doesn't have enough men to patrol the outlying properties. Convenient for whoever's behind it, Jackson observed. Harold's gaze sharpened. You think it's organized? Usually is, Jackson replied, thinking of similar operations he'd encountered in Texas and Kansas. Rustling that systematic takes planning, connections to sell the stolen stock. A loaded silence fell over the table, broken only when Sophia rose to clear the dishes. Well, Mr. Vance, we won't keep you with our troubles. You must be tired from your journey. Later that night, lying on the narrow but comfortable bed, Jackson listened to the wind in the cottonwoods and tried to ignore the unexpected pull he felt toward this place. It was just gratitude for a home-cooked meal and clean sheets, he told himself. Nothing more. Tomorrow he'd ride to the Rocking M, secure work, and be gone from the Winters homestead before he could form any troublesome attachments. The sound of the cabin door opening roused him from his thoughts. Through the small window he glimpsed Sophia's silhouette as she walked toward the barn, rifle in hand. Without hesitation, Jackson pulled on his boots and shirt and followed, his own revolver strapped to his hip. He found her perched on a hay bale just inside the barn door, rifle across her lap, gazing out at the moonlit property. Night watch, he asked softly, announcing his presence before approaching. She didn't seem startled. Someone needs to keep watch. Father needs his rest. And you need yours, Jackson pointed out, leaning against the doorframe. Hard to run a farm half asleep. Sophia's lips curved slightly. Are you volunteering, Mr. Vance? Seems only fair considering your hospitality. I'm a light sleeper anyway. Their eyes met in the silver darkness, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared burdens, of understanding what it meant to stand guard over what little you had left in the world. Very well, she said finally, standing and offering him the rifle. Wake me at first light, and I'll have breakfast ready before you head to the Rocking M. As she passed him in the doorway, the faint scent of lavender water momentarily displaced the familiar smells of hay and leather. Jackson found himself watching her retreating figure longer than necessary, a dangerous warmth spreading through his chest. You're just passing through, Vance, he reminded himself harshly. Don't get attached to what isn't yours. But as he settled onto the hay bale, rifle ready and eyes scanning the quiet homestead, Jackson couldn't ignore the treacherous thought that for the first time in years, he'd found a place that felt like it could be worth staying for. The next morning, Jackson rode to the Rocking M with a letter of introduction from Harold, who had taught the ranch owner's children before establishing his homestead. Marcus Montgomery proved to be a fair-minded man who valued Harold's recommendation, and after observing Jackson's skilled handling of an unruly stallion, offered him a position immediately. We've got a bunkhouse for the hands, Montgomery explained, but if you've arranged board with the Winters, that works too. God knows they could use the income and an extra set of eyes. This rustling business has everyone on edge. By mid-afternoon, Jackson had returned to the Winters' homestead with news of his employment and an unexpected proposal. Mr. Montgomery has agreed to let me stay here while working for him, he explained as they sat at the kitchen table. I'll pay you $4 weekly for room and board, and in exchange, I'd like to help secure your property against these rustlers. Harold and Sophia exchanged glances. That's more than our usual rate, Sophia pointed out. Consider it payment for the extra work I'll be doing, Jackson replied. I've dealt with rustlers before. You need better fencing on the north side, regular patrols, and probably a few strategic warning systems. Why would you do this? Harold asked directly. You're a hired hand for the Rocking M. Our problems aren't your concern. The question struck at the heart of what Jackson had been asking himself since making the impulsive offer to Montgomery. Why indeed was he inserting himself into the Winters' struggles when his life's pattern had been to avoid entanglement? Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people lose everything they've worked for, he said finally. And I'm in a position to help prevent it. No strings attached. When the rustling's dealt with or when I decide to move on, we part ways cleanly. No strings, Sophia repeated, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. Very well, Mr. Vance, we accept your offer. In the weeks that followed, Jackson fell into an unexpected rhythm. His days were spent working Montgomery's cattle, but his evenings and early mornings belonged to the Winters' homestead. He repaired fences, reinforced the barn, dug a new well closer to the house, and taught Sophia how to set up trip wires that would ring bells if intruders crossed their property at night. Harold, initially reserved, warmed to Jackson's presence, especially when the younger man showed interest in the older man's extensive book collection and knowledge of history. Their evenings often included discussions of the Civil War, Western expansion, and the changing nation while Sophia mended clothing or preserved vegetables from their garden. It was during these quiet evenings that Jackson felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. He found himself watching Sophia, the way candlelight caught in her hair, how her hands moved efficiently at any task, the rare but transformative smile that appeared when her father recounted a humorous anecdote. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered, fiercely independent yet tender with her father, practical but not without dreams, beautiful without any apparent awareness of it. One evening, as they walked the property line checking Jackson's newly installed warning system, Sophia broke their comfortable silence. You never speak of your family, Mr. Vance. After nearly a month in their home, she still addressed him formally, maintaining a careful distance that both frustrated and relieved him. Not much to tell that's worth the telling, he replied, automatically deflecting as he always did when the past came up. Sophia stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. The setting sun cast her in golden light, her expression quietly determined. I think there's a great deal worth telling, she said. I see it in how you handle thunder, in how you taught me to shoot more accurately, in the way you read my father's history books late into the night. You're running from something, Mr. Vance, or someone. Her perception unnerved him. We're all running from something out here, aren't we? Isn't that why people come west? Some come to build, not to escape, she countered, like my parents did. Jackson looked away, focusing on the distant mountains turning purple in the fading light. I had a family once. Lost them, end of story. It's never the end of the story, Sophia said softly, stepping closer. Not while you're still living it. The tenderness in her voice threatened to undo him completely. Jackson took an instinctive step back, needing distance from the dangerous warmth of her presence. "We should finish checking the perimeter before dark," he said, his voice rougher than intended. Sophia studied him a moment longer before nodding, accepting his retreat. But as they continued their circuit of the property, something had shifted between them. She had offered understanding, and he had refused it, yet the offer itself hung in the air like a promise neither of them could quite dismiss. That night Jackson dreamed of Texas, of his family's ranch burning while Confederate deserters drove off their cattle. He woke with a start, sweat-soaked and disoriented, to find Sophia standing in his doorway with a lamp. "You were calling out," she explained, concern etching her features, "something about stopping them." Embarrassment washed over him. "Apologies for waking you, just an old nightmare." Instead of leaving, she entered the room and set the lamp on the small table beside his bed. Without asking permission, she sat on the edge of the bed, her nightdress and wrapper modest but still startlingly intimate in the lamplight. "My mother used to say that nightmares lose their power when spoken aloud," she said, her voice gentle in the darkness. "I still dream of her dying in that wagon, telling my father helps." Her vulnerability offered freely broke something loose in Jackson's chest. Before he could reconsider, words began spilling out: how Confederate deserters had raided their Texas ranch while his father was away fighting, how they'd burned the barn with their best horses inside, how his mother had stood her ground with a shotgun. "I was 17, just a boy thinking I was a man," he said, staring at his hands. "Couldn't save the stock, couldn't save our home. After the war, we tried rebuilding, but the drought came. Then the fever took mother and my sister Emma in the same week." Sophia's hand covered his, warm and steady. "And your father?" "Gettysburg," Jackson said simply, "never came home." "So you've been carrying all this alone," she said, not as a question but as a simple truth recognized. "It's safer that way," he replied. "Caring about people, places, it just gives fate more targets." In the lamplight, Sophia's expression softened with understanding rather than pity. "That's a lonely way to live, Jackson." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice affected him more than he cared to admit. "It's a reliable way to live," he countered. "No expectations, no disappointments." "No joy either," she observed quietly, "no connection." Their eyes met in the soft glow, and Jackson became acutely aware of how close she sat, how the lamplight turned her hair to spun gold, how her presence filled the small room with something he'd been avoiding for years: possibility. Before he could respond, the warning bells he'd installed at the north fence line jangled sharply in the night. They both froze, then moved with practiced efficiency, Sophia extinguishing the lamp while Jackson grabbed his revolver from beneath his pillow. "Stay with your father," he whispered, already pulling on his boots. "Bolt the door behind me." "Not a chance," she replied, her voice equally low but firm. "This is our home, we defend it together." There was no time to argue. They moved silently through the cabin, pausing only to check on Harold, who was awake and already reaching for his shotgun. "North fence," Jackson murmured. "Sophia and I will check." "Keep watch from the front window, sir." Outside, the half-moon provided just enough light to navigate by. Jackson and Sophia moved in practiced tandem toward the triggered warning bell, communicating with hand signals he'd taught her. The night was eerily quiet, no cattle lowing in distress, no sounds of struggle or theft. They found the reason at the fence line. A young black bear cub had become entangled in the wire, triggering their alarm system. The frightened creature tugged frantically against its trap. "Where there's a cub, there's a mother," Sophia whispered, scanning the darkness. Jackson nodded, holstering his revolver and drawing his knife instead. "I'll free it, you keep watch for Mama Bear." Working carefully, Jackson approached the panicked cub, speaking in low, soothing tones while Sophia stood guard, rifle ready. The cub growled and swiped at him, but Jackson managed to cut the wire without harming the animal. The moment it was free, the cub bolted into the darkness. The relief of their false alarm dissolved into unexpected laughter as they made their way back to the cabin. "All that preparation and our first intruder is a bear cub," Sophia said, her eyes bright with residual adrenaline. "Father will find this highly amusing." "Better a bear than rustlers," Jackson replied, still scanning their surroundings out of habit. They walked close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, and Jackson found himself hyper-aware of each contact. The night's vulnerability had shifted something between them, creating an openness that both thrilled and terrified him. At the cabin door, Sophia paused, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Thank you for sharing your story earlier, Jackson. It means something knowing you trust me with it. Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then slipped inside to report to her father, leaving Jackson standing in the moonlight, his hand unconsciously rising to touch the spot where her lips had been. Draws. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself that luxury that he'd forgotten how it felt, terrifying and freeing all at once. As he followed her inside, Jackson realized with sudden clarity that despite his best intentions, he was forming attachments to this place, to these people. To Sophia, the thought should have sent him packing immediately. Instead, as he lay awake in the darkness, Jackson found himself contemplating what it might mean to stop running, to build something lasting on this patch of Montana soil. The prospect was as frightening as it was alluring. Fool's thinking, he muttered to himself, but for the first time in years he fell asleep with something dangerous blooming in his chest, hope. The rustlers struck 3 nights later, not at the Winters homestead but at the neighboring Wilson property. Jackson and Sophia responded to the sounds of gunfire, arriving to find James Wilson bleeding from a shoulder wound, while his terrified wife tried to stem the flow. 4 of them, Wilson gasped as Jackson examined the wound, took our best horses, headed north. While Sophia tended to Wilson and his wife, Jackson rode hard for the rocking M to alert Montgomery. By dawn, a posse had formed, including several of Montgomery's ranch hands, the sheriff, and Jackson. "You don't have to join us," Montgomery told him as they prepared to ride out. "Your job is cattle, not chasing outlaws." "I've got personal interest in stopping these rustlers," Jackson replied, checking his Winchester. "They hit too close to where I'm staying." Montgomery's weathered face creased in understanding. "The Winters place, heard you've been making improvements there. Harold's a good man, his daughter too." "They're just my landlords," Jackson said automatically, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Montgomery just nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Course they are, mount up." The posse tracked the rustlers north for 2 days, eventually cornering them in a box canyon near the Canadian border. The ensuing firefight was brief but violent. 2 of the rustlers were killed, 1 wounded and captured, and the 4th escaped into the rugged country. What troubled Jackson most was the captured rustlers' confession. They'd been hired by someone local to target specific properties, all small homesteads that had refused buyout offers from larger interests. "He wouldn't give a name," Sheriff Miller explained as they rode back toward Bridger Valley. "Just said his boss had plans for consolidating the valley, and folks who wouldn't sell needed persuading." Jackson thought of Sophia mentioning the Bar S Ranch buying up properties. "You have suspicions." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Nothing I can prove. The Bar S owner, Spencer, has powerful friends in Helena. Without the escaped rustler's testimony, we've got nothing solid." They returned to town 5 days after setting out, tired, dusty, and only partially successful. Jackson immediately rode for the Winters homestead, an uneasy feeling growing with every mile. He found Sophia in the garden, her face lighting up at the sight of him before she controlled her expression into something more measured. "You're back." "Father and I were getting concerned." "Got 2 of them, caught one who talked some," he explained, dismounting stiffly. "4th man escaped." "Was it?" She hesitated, glancing toward the house. "Someone's organizing it," Jackson confirmed, "targeting homesteads that won't sell. Sheriff suspects the Bar S Ranch but can't prove it." Sophia's face paled slightly. "Spencer sent his foreman 2 days ago with another offer. Higher than before, but still not enough to justify what we've built here." "What did your father say?" "What he always says, that this land is ours, and we're not selling at any price." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture he'd come to recognize. The foreman wasn't pleased, said his boss doesn't like being refused twice and some opportunities don't come around a 3rd time. The implied threat sent a cold jolt through Jackson. "I'm staying close to the property for a few days." "What about your work at the Rocking M?" "Montgomery understands. He's concerned about all this too." That evening, over a welcome home supper that Sophia had prepared with special care, Harold revealed more about their history with the Bar S Ranch. "Spencer wanted our water rights from the beginning," the older man explained. "Our creek feeds into the river that waters his grazing land. In dry years, controlling our water would give him advantage over the other ranchers." "There's more to it than that," Sophia added, her expression troubled. "The railroad survey crew came through last month. There's talk they might build a spur line through the valley to connect to the main northern Pacific route." Jackson understood immediately. And whoever owns the land where they build the depot stands to profit considerably. Harold nodded. Our property and the Wilsons together would make the perfect location, level ground, access to water, central to the valley. So Spencer's not just consolidating for ranching, Jackson mused. He's positioning for the future. A future that doesn't include small farmers, Sophia said quietly. Jackson studied her across the table, noting the worry in her eyes despite her composed expression. In that moment he made a decision that would alter the course of his carefully unattached existence. We won't let him win, he said firmly. This is your home and you have every right to keep it. We, Sophia asked, her gaze meeting his directly. We, Jackson confirmed, the word feeling both terrifying and right, if you'll have my help. Later that night, after Harold had retired, Jackson found Sophia on the porch, gazing at the stars. He joined her, leaning against the railing, their shoulders nearly touching. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice soft in the darkness, about caring giving fate more targets. Jackson tensed slightly. I've found it to be true. And yet you stayed, she observed. You're helping us fight for our home, knowing it might end badly. That doesn't sound like a man avoiding attachments. Her insight struck too close to the truth he'd been avoiding. Maybe I'm tired of running, he admitted. Or maybe some things are worth the risk. She turned to face him, moonlight silvering her features. What things, Jackson? The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility. Jackson knew he stood at a crossroads, retreat to the safety of emotional isolation or step forward into the unknown territory of connection, with all its attendant dangers and rewards. Before he could answer, hoofbeats approached rapidly from the direction of town. They both tensed, Jackson's hand moving automatically to his revolver as a rider emerged from the darkness, young Tommy Miller, the sheriff's son, his horse lathered from hard riding. Mr. Vance, the boy called, reining in sharply. Pa sent me. The rustler they captured broke out of jail 2 hours ago, killed Deputy Collins in the process. Damn, Jackson muttered, then glanced apologetically at Sophia. Any sign of where he's headed? Stole a horse from the livery, Tommy replied breathlessly. Pa thinks he might be heading back to whoever hired him. He's gathering men to search, but wanted to warn the homesteaders to be on guard. Thank you, Tommy, Sophia said, already moving toward the door. I'll wake Father. Tell the sheriff we'll keep watch here, Jackson instructed the boy, and Tommy ride careful heading back to town. As the boy galloped away, Sophia reappeared with her rifle. Father's getting his shotgun. What do you think this means? Jackson's expression was grim. It means someone doesn't want that rustler talking, and it means we need to be ready for trouble. They spent a tense night patrolling the property boundaries, but dawn broke without incident. Jackson rode to town for supplies and information, returning with troubling news. Sheriff organized search parties, but they lost the rustler's trail near the Bar's northern pasture, he reported as they secured the barn for the evening. And there's more. Wilsons have decided to sell to Spencer. After the raid and James being shot, Martha doesn't want to stay. Sophia's face fell. I can hardly blame them after what happened. But that means your property is now the key piece Spencer needs, Jackson finished. With the Wilsons selling, the pressure on you will increase. We won't sell, she said firmly, though he could see the worry in her eyes. This land is everything to Father, it's our future. Jackson wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything would be all right, but he'd seen too much frontier justice to offer false comfort. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that somehow felt more intimate than words. Whatever comes, he said quietly, you're not facing it alone. Her hand rose to cover his, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that startled them both. For a suspended moment the world narrowed to just this, their joined hands, shared breath, and the unspoken something growing between them. Sophia, he began, her name feeling like a prayer on his lips. A sharp crack split the air. Jackson reacted instinctively, pulling Sophia down behind the water trough as a bullet splintered the barn door where they'd been standing. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his revolver and scanning for the shooter. Another shot rang out from the direction of the north fence line, followed by the sound of breaking glass from the cabin. Father, Sophia gasped, already moving to rise. Jackson held her back. We need to circle around. Going straight across that open ground will get us both killed. Moving in a crouch, they used the barn for cover, then made their way along the irrigation ditch that ran toward the cabin. Jackson spotted movement near the cottonwoods, at least two men with rifles. When we reach the woodpile, I'll lay down covering fire, he murmured. You get to the house through the root cellar entrance. Check on your father and stay inside. Sophia's face was pale but determined. And you? I'll circle around behind them, Jackson replied. Just be ready to shoot anything that comes through that front door that isn't me. Their plan worked initially. Jackson's covering fire allowed Sophia to reach the root cellar unharmed, while he worked his way toward the attacker's position. He managed to wound one, a man he recognized as a Bar S ranch hand, before the second shooter retreated toward the woods. Jackson was pursuing when he heard a sound that froze his blood, Sophia's scream from inside the cabin, followed by a gunshot. Abandoning caution, he raced back to the house, finding the front door splintered open. Inside, Harold lay unconscious on the floor, blood seeping from a head wound. There was no sign of Sophia. Winters, Jackson knelt beside the older man, relieved to find him breathing. Harold, where's Sophia? The older man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused with pain. Third man came through the back, took her. His voice trailed off as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Cold fury replaced fear in Jackson's chest. After quickly binding Harold's wound and moving him to his bed, Jackson gathered ammunition, water, and his Winchester. Outside, he found signs of struggle leading toward the creek, boot prints, drag marks, and most telling, Sophia's hair ribbon caught on a bramble. I'm coming for you, he promised the empty air, his previous caution about attachment now completely abandoned. Nothing mattered except finding her. Tracking in the fading light was difficult, but Jackson had spent years honing this skill. The trail led north, toward Bar S territory, three men, one injured, and Sophia, sometimes walking, sometimes being dragged or carried. They were moving fast but carelessly, leaving clear signs for someone with Jackson's experience to follow. Night fell before he could catch up, forcing him to make camp and wait for first light. Every moment of delay was torture, his mind conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios. What sustained him through the long darkness was the memory of Sophia's strength, her fierce independence. She wouldn't surrender easily to whoever had taken her. Dawn found him already moving, following the trail with grim determination. By mid-morning, he spotted smoke rising from an abandoned line shack that sat just within Bar S boundaries. Approaching cautiously, Jackson circled the small structure, noting three horses tied outside, and a fourth, smaller horse he recognized immediately as Sophia's mare. Through a grimy window, he could see two men inside, the wounded Bar S hand and another man he didn't recognize. Sophia sat bound to a chair, her face bruised but her posture defiant. There was no sign of the third man. Jackson was plotting his approach when a voice behind him said, I wondered if you'd follow, Cowboy. He turned slowly, finding himself facing a well-dressed man holding a Colt revolver with practiced ease. Though they'd never met, Jackson recognized Spencer from descriptions, tall, silver-haired, with cold eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to flinch at creating more. Spencer, Jackson acknowledged, keeping his hands visible. Kidnapping seems beneath a man of your reputation. Business requires difficult decisions sometimes, Spencer replied smoothly. The girl and her father refused reasonable offers. Now they'll sign over their land at my price, or she won't be returning to that homestead. You've miscalculated, Jackson said, his voice deceptively calm while his mind raced through possible moves. Harold Winters is unconscious from your men's attack. He can't sign anything. A flicker of annoyance crossed Spencer's face. A complication certainly, but temporary. The old man will recover, and his daughter's safety will provide ample motivation. There's another complication, Jackson continued, shifting his weight slightly to better position himself. The sheriff knows your rustlers were targeting homesteaders who wouldn't sell. Your captured man talked before he escaped. Unfortunate but ultimately hearsay from a criminal, Spencer dismissed. Now drop your gun belt slowly. My men are expecting me. Jackson complied, letting his gun belt fall to the ground. As Spencer gestured for him to move toward the cabin, Jackson spotted movement in the trees behind the rancher, a flash of blue fabric and blonde hair. Somehow, impossibly, Sophia had freed herself. You know, there's something about the Winters place that confuses me, Jackson said, deliberately raising his voice. Why that land specifically? The water rights matter, sure, but there must be a dozen properties with access to that creek. The distraction worked. Spencer launched into a self-satisfied explanation about railroad surveys and future development plans, never noticing Sophia's approach until she brought a heavy branch down on his head with all her strength. Spencer crumpled, his unfired revolver falling beside him. Jackson moved instantly, retrieving his gun belt and Spencer's weapon while Sophia stood trembling with adrenaline and determination. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, scanning her for injuries beyond the bruises visible on her face. "Nothing serious," she replied, her voice steady despite everything. They weren't expecting a hairpin to make an effective lockpick. Relief and admiration flooded through him. "Your father, is he alive?" she interrupted, fear evident in her question. "Yes, head wound, but he was conscious briefly. We need to get you home to him." The cabin door opened, and one of Spencer's men stepped out, freezing at the sight of his unconscious boss and his supposedly captive prisoner standing free. Jackson's revolver leveled at him before he could reach for his weapon. "Call your friend out," Jackson ordered, slowly. Within minutes, both men were disarmed and secured with their own rope. Spencer was beginning to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. "The sheriff will be very interested in this operation," Jackson told the men as he and Sophia mounted their horses. "Especially with rustling, kidnapping, and assault charges on the table." As they rode away, leading the third horse with a bound, Spencer slumped in the saddle. Sophia finally allowed herself to tremble. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted quietly. Jackson looked at her in genuine surprise. "How could I not?" "Because caring gives fate more targets," she quoted his own words back to him. "Some things are worth the risk," he said, echoing their interrupted conversation from the night before. "Some people are worth fighting for." Their eyes met across the space between their horses, and Jackson knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, riding beside this remarkable woman, heading toward the place that had somehow become home when he wasn't looking. Harold was conscious when they returned, Sheriff Miller already at the homestead tending to him. The older man's relief at seeing his daughter safe transformed quickly to steely determination when told of Spencer's actions. "We have enough to arrest Spencer and his men," the sheriff confirmed after hearing their account. "The rustler we recaptured has already confirmed Spencer hired them to pressure homesteaders. With this kidnapping attempt, Spencer has sealed his fate." In the days that followed, the valley buzzed with the scandal. Spencer was charged with multiple crimes, his ranch temporarily placed under the management of his foreman while legal proceedings began. The Wilsons, learning the truth, rescinded their agreement to sell their property. For Jackson, these external events paled compared to the internal transformation he could no longer deny. One evening, 2 weeks after the kidnapping, he found Sophia at her mother's small garden plot behind the cabin, tending late summer flowers in the fading light. "Your father's looking much better," he said, approaching slowly. She smiled up at him, the bruises on her face now faded to yellowish shadows. "The doctor says he's healing well. Another week of rest and he can resume light duties." Jackson nodded, suddenly finding himself uncharacteristically nervous. He'd faced outlaws, stampedes, and wilderness with less trepidation than this conversation required. "I've been thinking," he began, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "With Spencer facing prison, there will be changes coming to the valley. Montgomery mentioned the possibility of buying some of Bar S land when it goes to auction. He's offered me a permanent position as his foreman." Sophia stilled, her hands hovering over the flowers. "That's a good opportunity. Foreman is a respectable position." "It is," Jackson agreed. "Means I'd be staying in the valley permanently." She stood slowly, brushing soil from her skirt, her expression carefully controlled. "I see, will you continue boarding with us?" "That depends," he said, taking a step closer. "On what?" Jackson reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "On whether you'd consider a different arrangement altogether, one that's more permanent." Sophia's breath caught as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Jackson Vance, are you proposing something?" "I'm proposing everything," he said simply. "I came here believing that caring only leads to loss. That attachment was a weakness I couldn't afford, but you, Sophia Winters, you've shown me that some connections are worth the risk. That sometimes, what looks like the end of a story is actually just the beginning." Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Are you certain? You've spent so long avoiding roots." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, drawing her closer. "I love you, Sophia. I think I started falling the moment you insisted you could change that wagon wheel yourself." Her laugh was watery with emotion. "I was so determined to prove I didn't need help. And yet here we are," he murmured, "proving that needing each other isn't weakness, it's strength." I love you too, she whispered, rising on her toes as his head lowered toward hers. Welcome home, Jackson Vance. Their first kiss held all the promise of the future they would build together, tender yet passionate, a meeting of equals who had found in each other not just love but partnership. The following spring, they married beneath the cottonwoods along the creek, Harold beaming proudly as he gave away his daughter. The entire valley turned out to celebrate, including Marcus Montgomery and his family, the Wilsons, and even Tommy Miller, who had appointed himself Jackson's unofficial assistant in all matters pertaining to ranch management. With Montgomery's support, Jackson and Sophia expanded the Winters homestead, combining farming and cattle raising into a promising operation. When the railroad indeed built its spur line through the valley later that year, their joint ventures with the Wilsons to provide services to the new depot brought prosperity neither family had imagined possible. On their first anniversary, Jackson surprised Sophia with a proper wooden sign for their expanded property. Vance Winters Ranch, it proclaimed in carefully carved letters. I considered just Vance Ranch, he admitted as they stood admiring it, but that wouldn't honor the foundation your family built here. Sophia leaned into his embrace, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her stomach, where their first child was beginning to make its presence known. It's perfect, she assured him, a name that honors the past while embracing our future. As the Montana sunset painted the distant mountains in gold and purple, Jackson Vance gazed across the land he'd once merely passed through and now called home. The dusty road that had brought him here no longer beckoned him onward. Instead, it had become simply the path friends and family traveled to visit the life he and Sophia were building together, a life richer and more fulfilling than his solitary wandering had ever been. No regrets about settling down, Sophia asked, reading his thoughtful expression. Jackson smiled, drawing her closer as thunder and her mare grazed peacefully nearby. Not a single one. Turns out home isn't a place you find, he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. It's a place you build with the right person by your side.